Get your things and leave, Julian. You are redundant. Keith Vance sneered as he pushed the white termination letter across the polished mahogany conference table. I looked at the paper, then at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking our brand-new $200 million office plaza. Through the glass, I could see the massive steel and glass towers of Vance Plaza standing tall against the gray morning sky, its lobby buzzing with the initial setup crews for our new anchor tenant. I felt my chest tighten, but I did not let my expression change. I looked back at Keith, his smirking face reflecting the cold light of the room, completely unaware of the massive trapdoor he had just stepped on. I slid the paper into my leather folder, buttoned my navy suit jacket, and stood up. "Understood," I replied. He did not know that the very ground beneath those towers was tied to a ticking clock, and I held the key. "Let us step back for a moment. You do not survive 18 years in commercial real estate by being soft or by relying on handshakes." I joined Vance Property Group back in 2008. I was 27, fresh out of my master's program in real estate development at Columbia, and eager to prove myself. Back then, Preston Vance, the founder and Keith's father, was still running the show. Preston was a tough, old-school developer who could calculate capitalization rates in his head and knew how to play the long game. He hired me as a junior acquisitions analyst. My starting salary was $55,000 a year, but I worked 80-hour weeks, learning the mechanical details of property plats, tax assessments, and local zoning codes. Over the next decade and a half, I moved up the ranks to become the senior portfolio manager. I knew every square foot of the company's holdings. I knew which roofs leaked, which HVAC units were near failure, and which municipal easements were expiring. Preston and I had a mutual respect. When he needed to acquire land for what would become Vance Plaza, the crown jewel of our firm, I was the one who negotiated the parcels. The site was a prime location right off the interstate, but it was a jigsaw puzzle of 22 separate lots owned by different families and holding companies. One of those critical lots was a 0.8-acre strip of land, designated on the city plat maps as Parcel 44B West. It was a narrow, L-shaped piece of property that ran between the main state route and the larger development site. Without it, the development site was completely landlocked. Now, here is the detail that Preston knew, but his son Keith never bothered to read in the archival property deeds. Parcel 44B West had belonged to my grandfather, Otis Thorne. He had owned a dairy farm on that land decades ago. When the area started to develop, my grandfather sold off most of his acreage, but he held on to that small strip due to a dispute with the county over a drainage ditch. When he passed away, he left that parcel to me. When Preston started buying up the land for the plaza in 2018, I did not want to hold the project hostage, nor did I want to create a conflict of interest. So, I set up a separate entity called Oak Ridge Access LLC. Through that LLC, I granted Vance Property Group a month-to-month license and access easement for a nominal fee of $1,200 a month. This allowed the company to construct the main 4-lane access boulevard, the entry monument, and run the main utility conduits, including the high-voltage electrical lines and the main water mains, under my strip of land. It was a temporary setup meant to be formalized into a permanent easement once the project was completed and my long-term equity partners were bought out. Preston signed the agreement, and it was filed away in the corporate vaults, forgotten by everyone except the accounting department that cut the monthly $1,200 check to Oak Ridge Access LLC. For years, things went smoothly. I managed the portfolio, keeping occupancy rates above 94% across all commercial assets. But by 2022, Preston's health began to decline. He stepped back from daily operations and handed the reins of Vance Property Group to his son, Keith. Keith was 32, had a brand new MBA from an expensive school, and carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed he had hit a home run when he was merely born on third base. He immediately brought in his own crew of consultants, talked constantly about synergy and streamlining overhead, and treated the long-term staff like relic fixtures from a bygone era. My real trouble with Keith started when I began negotiating the lease for our new anchor tenant, Vanguard Logistics Group. They wanted to lease 60% of Vance Plaza, occupying 12 floors of the main tower for their regional headquarters. It was a massive deal, a 15-year lease worth $120 million in total gross rent. It was the kind of transaction that defines a career. Under my employment contract, which Preston had signed back in 2016, I was entitled to a 1.5% override commission on the total value of any new master leases I initiated and closed. That amounted to a $1.8 million performance bonus, payable within 30 days of the tenant taking physical possession of the space. For 9 months, I lived and breathed the Vanguard deal. I negotiated the tenant improvement allowances, the parking ratios, the load factors, and the sublease clauses. Keith, meanwhile, only showed up at the photo ops and the final signing ceremony. He shook hands with the Vanguard executives, took the credit in the local business journal, and immediately started looking for ways to avoid paying me my contracted bonus. He did not want $1 million plus payout going to an employee, even if that employee had spent 18 years building the foundation of his father's company. In the weeks leading up to Vanguard's official move-in date, which was scheduled for the first Monday of the month, Keith's attitude toward me grew increasingly cold. He began micromanaging my weekly reports, questioning my travel expenses, and assigning me menial tasks. I could see the writing on the wall. He was looking for a reason, any reason, to push me out before the 30-day payout window closed. What he did not realize was that by trying to cut me out, he was about to sever the main artery of the entire development. I kept my mouth shut, kept my records in order, and waited for his move. I knew that in the corporate game of chess, the one who moves too early often leaves their king completely exposed. The trap was sprung on the last weekend of the month. My daughter, Clara, was graduating from her undergraduate program at Georgetown. It was a milestone event for our family, and I had requested 3 days off 6 months in advance. Preston had personally approved the leave on our shared Outlook calendar before his retirement, but Keith was not his father. On the Friday before the graduation, as I was packing my briefcase at 4 in the afternoon, Keith walked into my office. He did not knock. He leaned against the doorframe, checking his gold watch, and told me he had scheduled an emergency leadership call for Sunday morning at 9. I looked at him, keeping my voice level. "Keith, you know I will be in Washington for Clara's graduation ceremony. It has been approved on the calendar for half a year. I will be sitting in the auditorium during that time." Keith gave a dismissive shrug, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Well, things change, Julian. We are onboarding Vanguard on Monday. If you cannot make the call, it shows a lack of commitment to the firm's future. I suggest you align your priorities." He turned and walked out before I could respond. I did not cancel my trip. I spent 18 years sacrificing my weekends and evenings for Vance Property Group, but I was not going to miss my daughter walking across that stage for a manufactured crisis. On Sunday morning at 9, my phone began to vibrate in my pocket. I was sitting in the third row of the auditorium, watching my daughter receive her diploma. I reached down, flipped the switch to silent, and placed it back in my pocket. Over the next hour, the phone buzzed 12 times. I did not look at it. I focused on my daughter's smile. When I checked my phone after the ceremony, I had 10 missed calls from Keith and 2 emails from the corporate HR portal with the subject line containing the phrase "urgent inquiry." I knew exactly what Keith was doing. He was building a paper trail of insubordination to justify a termination for cause which would allow the company to invalidate my employment agreement and refuse my commission under Section 9 of my contract. On Monday morning at 8, I walked into the office. The air felt heavy. My assistant, a young woman who had worked with me for 3 years, could not even look me in the eye. She kept her head down, staring at her keyboard. Before I could even sit down at my desk, my phone rang. It was Lawrence Cole, the chief legal officer. He asked me to join him and Keith in the main glass conference room on the top floor. When I entered, Keith was sitting at the head of the table, his arms crossed, looking like a judge preparing to hand down a sentence. Lawrence Cole sat next to him, looking uncomfortable, a thick manila folder resting between his hands. I sat down opposite them and placed my leather folder on the table. "We have a problem, Julian," Keith started, his voice dripping with artificial disappointment. "We are at the finish line of the largest lease deal in this company's history, and you decided to go completely off the grid. You missed a critical transition meeting yesterday morning. I called you 10 times. You ignored my calls. I looked at Lawrence, then back at Keith. My leave was approved 6 months ago, Keith. The transition documents for Vanguard were completed and uploaded to the tenant portal last Thursday. There was no emergency. It does not matter, Keith snapped, his voice rising as he leaned forward. A direct order from the Vice President of Operations overrides a standing calendar entry. Your refusal to attend the call constitutes gross insubordination. We cannot have senior leaders who think they are above the rules. We are terminating your employment, effective immediately, for cause. Lawrence Cole opened the folder and slid a 2-page document toward me. This is the official termination notice, Julian, Lawrence explained, his voice low and mechanical. Because this is a termination for cause based on willful neglect of duty and insubordination. The company is exercising its right under Section 9B of your agreement. Your severance package is forfeited, and all pending commissions, including the Vanguard override, are null and void. I picked up the document and read through the paragraphs. The text was clear. They had drafted this days in advance. The dates, the citations of company policy, and the specific references to Section 9B were all typed out neatly. Keith had planned this entire sequence to pocket my $1.8 million commission and hand the victory to his own operational budget. I looked at Keith. His chest was puffed out, a look of triumphant satisfaction on his face. He believed he had just pulled off a brilliant corporate maneuver, saving the company nearly $2 million while removing a senior executive who represented his father's era. He expected me to scream, to threaten legal action, or to beg for a compromise. Instead, I took out my pen, signed the acknowledgement of receipt, and slid the paper back across the table. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and picked up my folder. "Understood," I said. "Is that it?" Keith asked, his brow furrowing, clearly disappointed by my lack of emotion. "You are not going to argue?" "There is nothing to argue, Keith. The terms of my exit are signed. I will have my personal belongings packed by noon." "You do that, Julian," Keith said, regaining his smug tone. "And remember, you are under a strict 12-month non-compete. Do not even think about talking to our clients." I did not answer. I walked out of the conference room, descended the stairs to my office, and began packing my desk. As I placed my grandfather's framed photo and my personal documents into a cardboard box, I looked out the window parking lot below. The parking lot, the main entrance road, and the underground utility lines all ran through my family's narrow strip of land. Keith thought he had just fired an employee. He had no idea he had just evicted his own landlord. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I was sitting in the corner office of Sarah Jenkins, my personal real estate attorney. Sarah and I had gone to the same undergraduate school, and she had spent the last 15 years building a reputation as one of the sharpest property litigators in the city. Her office was filled with stacks of legal briefs and land registry maps, a testament to her work ethic. I placed the termination letter and my old employment contract on her desk. "They did it," I said, leaning back in the leather chair. "Keith terminated me for cause. He used a missed conference call on Sunday to trigger Section 9B, wiping out my severance and the Vanguard commission." Sarah picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the paragraphs with practiced speed. A small, cold smile appeared on her face as she read Keith's signatures. "Section 9B, she muttered. "He really thinks he is a genius." She laid the papers down and looked at me. "I assume you brought the other document?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a blue folder containing the original 2018 month-to-month license and access easement agreement. I handed it to her. "Here is the contract between Vance Property Group and Oak Ridge Access LLC. For parcel 44B West." Sarah opened the folder. She did not need to read the whole thing. She had helped me draft it 8 years ago, but she wanted to verify the exact wording of the key clauses. "Let us review the specific terms," she said, tapping her pen on the page. "Preston Vance signed this on behalf of the company during the initial land assembly phase. He was so focused on getting the construction financing approved that he did not object to our protective clauses. He knew you were the owner of the LLC, but he trusted you, and he never envisioned a scenario where his own family would turn on you." She pointed to Section 4 of the agreement, which was titled Term and Conditions of License. I looked at the text. It read, "The license granted herein for road access, right-of-way, and utility installation on parcel 44B West is contingent upon the continuous active employment of Julian Thorne with the license. In the event that Julian Thorne's employment with Vance Property Group is terminated for any reason, whether voluntary or involuntary, with or without cause, this license shall immediately transition to a revocable status. The licensor reserves the right to terminate this agreement and revoke all access and utility rights upon 72 hours written notice to the license." "This is beautiful," Sarah said, her smile widening. "Keith was so eager to fire you to save a $1.8 million bonus that he did not bother to check the master file for the underlying land. He did not realize that the moment he pushed you out, he handed you the power to shut down his entire development. Is there any legal loophole they can use to block the revocation?" I asked, wanting to ensure our position was airtight. "None," Sarah replied confidently. "This is a license, not a permanent easement. A permanent easement requires a lump sum purchase and a deed recording that transfers the property rights in perpetuity. Preston only wanted to pay a monthly fee to keep capital free for construction. The agreement clearly states that the license is month to month and contingent on your employment. The utilities, meaning the high-voltage power conduits and the water lines running under the boulevard, are also covered under the same license. Once we revoke it, any continued presence of their pipes, cables, or vehicles on your land constitutes a civil trespass under state law. How quickly can we draft and serve the notice?" I asked. "I have the template ready on my computer," Sarah said, turning to her keyboard. "I will customize the details, attach the original 2018 contract, and specify the exact boundaries of parcel 44B West. We will have it served by a professional courier to Keith Vance, Preston Vance, and Lawrence Cole by 4 o'clock this afternoon. We will also send it via certified mail with return receipt requested. The 72-hour clock will start the moment the courier delivers the letters." I watched Sarah type, the rhythmic sound of the keys filling the room. It felt strange to realize that 18 years of loyalty and hard work could be reduced to a single page of legal text. I had given my youth to Vance Property Group. I had worked late nights in empty office buildings, missed dinners, and tolerated the growing arrogance of a second-generation successor who had done nothing to earn his position. I had tried to play fair, but Keith had chosen to turn our professional relationship into a street fight. By 3:30, the documents were signed and sealed. The notice was formal and uncompromising. It stated that due to the termination of Julian Thorne's employment on July 27, 2026, Oak Ridge Access LLC was officially revoking the license for road access and utilities on parcel 44B West. Vance Property Group was ordered to remove all vehicles, blockades, and equipment from the parcels and to cease all utility transmissions through the property by 4 p.m. on Thursday, July 30, 2026. Any failure to comply would result in immediate physical blockades of the road and legal action for trespass. After the courier left Sarah's office, I drove back to my house. I sat on my porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the afternoon sun filter through the trees. For the first time in 18 years, I did not have an inbox full of urgent corporate emails or a list of properties to review, but I knew the peace would not last. Within 3 days, the storm would hit, and Keith Vance would find out exactly what happens when you try to steal from the person who holds the ground beneath your feet. The 72 hours expired at exactly 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. Keith had apparently treated our formal legal notice as a bluff. My former assistant texted me that Keith had laughed during a morning staff meeting, boasting that I was trying to play games but had no cards left to play. He was so caught up in planning the ribbon-cutting ceremony for Vanguard Logistics Group that he did not even consult the company's legal department until it was too late. He assumed that because the entry road looked like a public street, it was protected by municipal law. He did not understand the difference between a dedicated public easement and a private license. At 4:15, a crew of commercial fencing contractors I had hired arrived at the entrance of Vance Plaza. They brought 2 flatbed trucks carrying heavy concrete barriers, commonly known as Jersey barriers, and a team of workers with steel chain-link fencing panels. I had also hired 2 off-duty police officers to oversee the installation, ensuring that there would be no physical altercations and that the boundary lines were respected. Under the supervision of a licensed land surveyor, who had marked the exact property lines of Parcel 44B West, the workers began placing the concrete barriers across the 4-lane boulevard. They bolted the chain-link panels to the concrete, sealing off the entrance completely. Large, reflective signs were hung from the fence panels: private property, no trespassing, access revoked by Oak Ridge Access LLC. Simultaneously, the water and power utility companies acted on the notices we had sent them. Commercial utility providers are highly sensitive to legal liability. Once Sarah provided them with the recorded deeds and the revoked license agreement showing that their lines were running through private property without a valid easement, they did not want to risk a lawsuit for trespass. A crew from the city water department turned off the main water valve at the property boundary, and the electric company sent a technician to disconnect the primary transformer feed. Within 30 minutes, the entire Vance Plaza development was dark, dry, and completely inaccessible. Friday morning was the scheduled move-in day for Vanguard Logistics Group. At 7:30, the first convoy of 6 large moving trucks carrying office furniture, server racks, and corporate files arrived at the plaza. Behind them was a line of 40 employee cars. They were met by a solid concrete barrier and a chain-link fence. The moving foreman, seeing the private property signs and the off-duty police officers, stopped the trucks and refused to enter. My phone, which had been silent for 3 days, began to light up. It started with Keith. He called 3 times in rapid succession. I did not answer. Then Lawrence Cole, the chief legal officer, called. I ignored that as well. Finally, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately, Preston Vance's private cell phone. I answered on the 4th ring. Hello, Preston. I said, Julian, what the hell is going on? Preston's voice was strained, hoarse with age and sudden stress. I am standing outside the plaza. There are moving trucks blocked on the highway, police officers everywhere, and the main tower has no power. Keith says you are running an extortion scheme. I took a slow breath. Preston, I respect you, but Keith terminated my contract on Monday for cause to avoid paying my Vanguard commission. He threw me out and nullified my agreement. The license agreement for the access road and the utilities under Parcel 44B West was contingent on my active employment. Keith chose to fire me. By doing so, he chose to terminate the access to his own building. Preston was silent for a long moment. I could hear the wind blowing through his phone and the distant sound of truck engines idling. He did not know about the termination? I asked. No. Preston muttered, his voice sounding suddenly very old. Keith told me you resigned because you could not handle the pressure. He said the Vanguard deal was closed and we were clean. Keith lied to you, Preston. He fired me for missing a Sunday call while I was at my daughter's graduation. He did this specifically to steal the $1.8 million override commission I spent 9 months earning. I heard Preston swear under his breath. Let me speak to Lawrence, he said. You can speak to Lawrence, Preston, but the barriers stay up. My lawyer, Sarah Jenkins, will handle all communication from now on. If you want to resolve this, you need to meet us at her office. And you need to bring Keith. I hung up before he could argue. 5 minutes later, Sarah received an email from Lawrence Cole, begging for an emergency meeting. He admitted that Vanguard's corporate counsel had already contacted VPG, threatening to terminate their 15-year lease and sue for $10 million in damages if they were not allowed into the building by Monday morning. Vance Property Group's construction loan, which was tied to Vanguard taking possession of the space, was also at risk of immediate default. The company was staring at a $35 million disaster, all because Keith wanted to avoid paying a $1.8 million bonus. Sarah scheduled the meeting for 2 o'clock that afternoon. I spent the morning sitting in her conference room, drinking coffee and reviewing our terms. I had no intention of being reasonable. I had spent 18 years building their company, and they had tried to throw me out like trash. Now, the tables were turned, and I was going to make sure they paid for every single brick they had laid on my land. At 2 o'clock, the glass door of Sarah's conference room opened. Preston Vance walked in first. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. Behind him came Lawrence Cole, carrying a laptop and a thick stack of folders, looking like a man preparing for a long siege. Keith brought up the rear, his face flushed red with anger, glaring at me with pure hatred. "This is illegal." Keith yelled before he even sat down, pointing a finger at me. "You are obstructing commerce, Julian. You are blocking a public access point. I have already called the city council and our lawyers. We are going to sue you for every dime you have." "Keith, sit down and shut up," Preston said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of 40 years of authority. Keith stared at his father, shocked, before sinking into a chair at the far end of the table. Sarah opened her folder and slid a copy of the 2018 license agreement across the table to Lawrence Cole. "Lawrence," she said calmly, "let us skip the theatrics. You have reviewed the document. You know the license for Parcel 44B West was contingent on Julian's active employment. You know the utilities and the road access are legally situated on Julian's private property. And you know that under state law, a license is revocable at will once the conditions are met." Lawrence Cole sighed, rubbing his temples. He did not look at Keith. "Yes, Sarah, I have reviewed the file. The contract is valid. Preston signed it in 2018. So you agree that any attempt to remove the concrete barriers or reconnect the utilities without our consent constitutes a criminal trespass?" Sarah asked. "Yes," Lawrence admitted quietly. "The company has no right-of-way without the license." Keith looked from Lawrence to his father, panic finally starting to replace his anger. "Lawrence, what are you talking about?" he stammered. "We own the plaza. We can just eminent domain the strip." "Eminent domain is for government entities, Keith, not private developers," Lawrence snapped, his patience completely gone. "It would take 3 years of litigation, and by next week, Vanguard will walk away, our construction loans will default, and we will be bankrupt. We do not have 3 years. We do not even have 3 days." Preston leaned forward, resting his hands on his cane. He looked at me, his eyes clouded with regret. "Julian, we have known each other for 18 years. I know you are a man of your word. What is it going to take to get those barriers down and the power turned back on?" I looked Preston straight in the eye. I had no desire to destroy his life's work, but I was not going to let Keith's greed go unpunished. I opened my folder and read from the sheet of paper I had prepared. First, Vance Property Group will pay my Vanguard Logistics Group commission in full. That is $1,800,000, as detailed in my 2016 employment agreement. Preston nodded slowly. "Agreed. What else?" "Second, I will sell Parcel 44B West to Vance Property Group, but I will not sell it for the nominal valuation. The price is $2 million. This will give you permanent, irrevocable ownership of the entry road and the utility corridors." Keith let out a choked gasp of outrage. $2 million for a swampy strip of grass? That is robbery. Preston ignored him, keeping his eyes on me. "And the third condition, Julian?" "I know there is a third. The third condition is Keith's resignation," I said, keeping my voice cold and flat. "He will step down as Vice President of Operations effective today. He will have no management role, no voting rights on property assets, and no involvement in Vance Property Group's operations. I spent 18 years helping you build this company, Preston. I will not watch an incompetent, greedy amateur tear it down because he wanted to play games with my livelihood." "No way!" Keith screamed, slamming his hands on the table as he stood up. "Dad, you cannot let him do this. This is our family business. He is trying to force me out." Preston looked at his son. For a long, painful minute, the room was completely silent. The only sound was Keith's heavy, angry breathing. Preston looked at the folder, then at Lawrence Cole, who gave a slow, imperceptible nod. Finally, Preston looked back at Keith. "Keith, you lied to me," Preston said, his voice cracking slightly. "You told me Julian resigned. You tried to steal his commission to boost your own numbers, and in doing so, you put a $200 million asset at risk. You do not have the intelligence or the integrity to run this company." "You are done, Dad," Keith pleaded, his face turning pale. "Go back to the office, pack your things, and go home," Preston said, his voice hardening. "Lawrence will handle your transition out of the firm. If you say one more word in this room, I will cut off your trust fund." Keith stood frozen for a few seconds, looking at his father's cold expression, then at Lawrence, and finally at me. He realized he had lost everything. He turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Preston turned back to me. He looked smaller now, older, but there was a sense of relief in his posture. Lawrence will draft the settlement agreement and the deed transfer for Parcel 44B West immediately, he said. The wire transfers will be executed before we leave this room. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Sarah confirmed that 2 wire transfers had cleared into my bank account. One for $1.8 million for the Vanguard Commission, and another for $2 million for the sale of the land. A total of $3.8 million. I signed the deed transfer, handing permanent ownership of the access strip to Vance Property Group. I then called the fencing contractor and instructed them to remove the concrete barriers and the chain-link panels. Sarah sent a formal notice to the utility companies, confirming that the easement dispute had been settled, and within an hour, the power and water were restored to Vance Plaza. Over the weekend, Vanguard Logistics Group completed their move-in without any further delays. Preston Vance announced his permanent retirement the following Monday, appointing Lawrence Cole as the interim CEO to stabilize the company. Keith was sent to manage a small, underperforming retail strip in upstate New York, completely removed from the core business. As for me, I did not look back. I used the $3.8 million to establish Thorn Land Group, a commercial real estate firm specializing in land assembly and easement consultation. Within 6 months, 3 of the top leasing brokers from Vance Property Group joined my firm. Sometimes, when I drive down the interstate, I look at the glass towers of Vance Plaza standing in the distance. I smile, remembering the narrow strip of land that held it all together, and the lesson Keith Vance learned the hard way. In real estate, just like in life, the foundation is everything.